the night settles heavy over the northern seas. A thin silver moon hangs low, reflected in the dark waters of the fjord. The waves are not loud, but constant, breathing in and out against the rocky shore. A wind moves across the high cliffs, carrying the bite of salt and snow, even in the summer months. The mountains rise like shadowed giants, black against the starlit sky, and the forest below is hushed, branches swaying gently, as though the land itself were listening. Along the shoreline, a single fire burns. Its light flickers against the timber of a longhouse, dancing in orange and gold against the carved dragon heads of boats pulled onto the beach. Smoke rises into the night, curling into the endless dark, carrying with it the scent of pine, charred wood, and cooked meat. Inside, voices are low, a murmur of men and women gathered together, telling stories, sharing warmth, reminding each other that they belong to something greater than themselves. To live in such a land was to know hardship, cold, hunger, and danger were constants, yet within the circle of kin, there was comfort. The fire was not only flame, but safety. The longhouse was not only wood and roof, but family. And outside, beyond that firelight, was the loneliest place of all, the wilderness, the emptiness, the silence of being without a clan. To be a Viking was never to stand alone. A man, a woman, even a child, each life was bound tightly within the cords of kinship. Clan was not just family by blood. It was a living shield of brothers, sisters, uncles, cousins, and sworn allies, all woven together in loyalty. Without them, the world was too harsh, too unforgiving. With them, even the bitter cold of the northern winter could be endured. The clan was survival. In times of hunger, when the sea yielded little and the fields gave less, it was the shared storehouse of grain and dried fish that kept people alive. In times of danger, when raiders came from across the water or wolves prowled the edge of the forest, it was the clan that raised shields, that stood shoulder to shoulder, that defended every life within its hall. The clan was honor. In Viking thought, honor was a treasure greater than silver or gold. If an insult was thrown, it was not only the man who bore the shame, but his entire family. And so vengeance, or justice, was never an individual matter. It was the clan that avenged wrongs, the clan that defended reputation. To be remembered in stories, to have one's deeds sung by the skalds, was only possible because a clan stood behind you. The clan was belonging. In the longhouse, when the fire burned bright, when the smell of roasted meat and ale filled the air, it was the laughter of kin that gave life its meaning. A man might be bold at sea, fearless in battle, but without the warmth of family beside him, even the strongest would feel empty. To lose one's clan, then, was to lose more than family. It was to lose food, safety, honor, and the right to belong in the world. A Viking without a clan was not truly a Viking at all. He was a shadow, wandering the edge of firelight, longing for what he could no longer claim. Imagine him now, a man standing at the edge of the fjord, the sea dark at his feet, the longhouse fires far behind him. He carries no banner, no clan mark on his shield. No one waits for him at the hearth. No kin speaks his name with pride. He is a figure, a parton outcast. Once, perhaps, he was like any other. He may have been born to a hall where laughter rang, where a mother sang to him, where a father taught him the weight of an axe. but fate is cruel, and in this world, fate was written not in gentle ink, but in blood. Perhaps his kin were lost to sickness, to hunger, to a feud that ended in slaughter. Or, perhaps worse perhaps, he was cast out, stripped of honor, declared an outlaw by his own people. Now, his life is marked by silence. When he approaches a farmstead, doors close. When he walks into a market, voices fall, and eyes follow with suspicion. No one offers him food. No one swears him loyalty. For without a clan, a Viking is not just alone, he is dangerous. He has no one to protect, and no one to avenge him. His death would bring no blood feud, no justice, no consequence. To kill him would be no crime. At night, he sleeps not in a warm hall, but in the cold, curled beneath the trees, the wind gnawing at his bones. His dreams are haunted not only by hunger, but by memory of what it meant to belong. For the cruelest punishment was not death, but banishment. And to live clanless in the Viking age was to be exiled not only from people, but from meaning itself. Asterisk. In the Viking world, family was not simply a matter of affection. It was the very structure of life itself. Every man and woman carried not only their own name, but the weight of those who came before. A person was never just an individual. They were son of, daughter of, descendant of. Bloodlines stretched back like roots of an ancient tree, binding generations together, giving strength to those who lived and dignity to those who had passed. Kinship meant protection. If a man was wronged, his brothers stood with him. If he was slain, it was his cousins, uncles, or sons who carried out vengeance, ensuring his death did not go unanswered. This was more than loyalty, it was law. In a world without prisons, without a standing guard, justice was written in blood, and only a family strong enough to demand it could make the world take notice. Kinship also meant inheritance. Land was scarce in the north, and every field, every stretch of pasture was precious. To be born into a family was to be born into a claim. It was to have a place to stand, a right to call the earth beneath your feet your own. Without blood ties, a man had no land, no claim, no stake in the future, and kinship meant memory. In the sagas, men and women are remembered not only for what they achieved, but for the family they belonged to. Deeds were never told in isolation. They were tied to lineage. A man who fought bravely was praised as the worthy son of his father, the proud heir of his kin. To have no family, no bloodline, was to vanish from the record of history. For a Viking then, blood was more than life. It was identity, honor, and survival woven into one. To be cut off from it was not just to be alone, it was to be rootless. As if the great tree of kinship had cast you out into the cold, to wither and be forgotten. Asterisk. In the Viking world, there were no kings commanding armies of scribes, no sprawling courts lined with parchment and seals. Justice was not a matter of distant rulers. It was decided in the open air, beneath the wide northern sky, at a gathering known simply as the Thing. The Thing was more than a meeting. It was a living expression of the clan system. Here, men of standing came together, representing not just themselves, but the families and kin who stood behind them. Disputes were heard, boundaries set, marriages arranged, and blood feuds weighed. The law was spoken aloud, remembered by heart, carried not in books but in memory. entrusted to those with wisdom and authority. Yet the thing was not a place for the clanless. To have a voice there, a man needed kin behind him, proof that he was not a rootless wanderer, but part of a web of oaths and obligations. A lone man had no weight, for who would enforce his words? Who would avenge him if his case was ignored? His voice, if it rose at all, was nothing but wind. For those with family, the thing was protection. If you were accused of a crime, it was your kin who stood beside you, speaking in your defense, swearing oaths on your behalf. If you brought a grievance, it was your kin who gave weight to your claim. Without them, a man stood exposed, naked before the law, with no shield against injustice. To be clanless then was not only to lose food, shelter, and warmth, it was to lose a place in the very fabric of order itself. Outside the thing, there was only chaos. And a Viking who could not stand within the circle of law was already half a ghost, walking the earth with no name, no rights, and no home. The long nights of the north could be harsh, but within the walls of the longhouse, warmth gathered like a shield against the cold. When a feast was called, the benches filled quickly, men and women shoulder to shoulder, the air alive with laughter and the crackle of fire. The smell of roasted meat drifted from the hearth, mingling with the sweetness of honeyed ale. Horns were raised, songs began, and for a few precious hours, hardship was forgotten. Feasts were not only moments of pleasure, they were acts of unity. To eat together was to declare loyalty, to drink together was to renew bonds of kinship. Every toast to an ancestor, every song sung of old battles, reminded the hall of who they were, and who stood beside them. The presence of kin gave the food meaning, and the fellowship gave the ale strength. It was also at feasts that alliances were forged. Guests from neighboring clans might be welcomed, gifts exchanged, marriages discussed. A single night of merriment could shape the course of generations. And through it all, the skalds, the poets wove sagas in song, ensuring that names and deeds would echo long after the fire burned out. But for the clanless, there was no seat at the table. The longhouse door might open to welcome kin and honored guests, but it closed firmly against the outcast. He stood outside, shivering in the dark, hearing the muffled roar of voices within, smelling the food but tasting none of it. For him, the fire was not a shield, but a reminder of what he had lost. To feast was to belong. To be barred from feasting was to be erased. And in a world where memory was survival, the outcast slipped further into silence with every night that passed. When the horns sounded and the war cries rose, the Viking shield wall was more than a tactic, it was survival made flesh. A single warrior, no matter how strong, was only a man, but in the shield wall, standing shoulder to shoulder, shield overlapping shield, the clan became a living fortress. Each man's life depended on the one beside him. A weak arm could open a gap. A faltering step could bring ruin. Trust was not optional. It was the difference between life and death. That trust was born of kinship. Brothers who had eaten at the same hearth, who had grown up beneath the same roof, who had avenged each other's wrongs, these were the men you wanted beside you. When the enemy charged, the shield wall was a test of loyalty as much as courage. To hold your ground while arrows darkened the sky, to press forward when the clash of steel rang in your ears, required faith not only in yourself but in your kin. for the wall was only as strong as its weakest bond. But imagine the outcast, the clanless man, who would trust him to hold the line, who would risk his life on the steadiness of a stranger. No shield wall would welcome him, for he had no kin to vouch for him, no lineage to guarantee his honor. On the battlefield, he was either pushed aside or left to fight alone, a single shield against many. And in that loneliness, death came quickly. To die in the shield wall was to die with glory, with your brothers at your side, your name remembered in song. To die alone, clanless, was to vanish, your body trampled into the mud, your memory lost to silence. In Viking eyes, there could be no greater dishonor. Marriage in the Viking age was never only about two people. It was a bond between families, not tying bloodlines together, weaving alliances that could shape the fate of entire clans. A wedding was a union of hearts, yes, but also a union of power, land, and honor. Fathers and uncles arranged matches carefully, weighing the worth of dowries, the strength of kinship ties, and the possibility of forging peace with rivals. A daughter's hand could end a feud. A son's marriage could expand territory. Even in matters of love, the clan was always present, watching, guiding, deciding. For those within a clan, marriage meant security. A bride entered her husband's hall with kin to protect her, kin to avenge her if she was wronged. A groom, in turn, gained not only a wife but the backing of her family, their wealth, and their loyalty. Every child born carried the blood of both lineages, ensuring that the clan's roots grew deeper into the soil of the future. But what of the clanless? For them, marriage was nearly impossible. Who would give their daughter to a man with no kin to protect her, no family to strengthen her life, no bloodline to carry forward? A clanless woman, too, stood alone, with no dowry to offer, no brothers or uncles to defend her. To marry without kin was to marry without safety, without status, without meaning. And so the outcast often faced a harsher fate than loneliness in battle or hunger in winter, the fate of leaving no legacy at all, no wife to share his nights, no children to carry his name, no family to tell his story when he was gone. In a culture where memory was life after death, this was a second kind of exile, not only from the living, but from eternity itself. In the Viking world, a name was more than a word. It was a gift, a burden, a thread binding a man or woman to their ancestors. A child might be named for a grandfather who fought bravely, or for a grandmother whose wisdom was famed across the field. To speak a name was to summon history, to remind the living of those who had come before. And when deeds were done, voyages across the sea, victories in battle, feats of courage or craft, they were not left to fade. The skalds, the poets of the north, wove them into sagas and songs. Around the hearth fire, in the glow of lamplight, the names of heroes were spoken aloud, their stories stitched into memory, to be carried forward by each new generation. To be remembered was to live on, but only those with kin could be certain of such remembrance. A clan carried its own tales, each man and woman a branch of a greater tree. When one fell, the others told the story, ensuring the name endured. The saga was not just of individuals, but of lineages. Each member a piece of something larger, something eternal. For the clanless, there was no such promise. No one to speak the name, no family to remind the skald of their deeds, no descendants to keep the memory alive. They might live, they might fight, they might even win small victories, but once they were gone, silence swallowed them. The sagas rarely spoke of such men, for they left no roots, no echoes. To a Viking, death was not the end. To be forgotten was, and for the outcast, doomed to vanish without story or song, the fate was darker than the grave. Not every Viking who was clanless was a grown man cast out for dishonor. Some were children left behind, not by choice, but by cruel fortune. Sickness could sweep through a hall, striking down mother and father in a single season. A raid might leave a homestead burning, its adults slain, its children wandering amid the ashes. Famine, accident, or feud, the causes were many, but the result was the same: a young life suddenly cut adrift. For a Viking child, family was more than love, it was shield and shelter. Fathers and uncles taught the skills of farming, seafaring, and war. Mothers and aunts held the knowledge of healing, weaving, and keeping a household alive through the lean months. Cousins, brothers, and sisters stood together as playmates, but also as the promise of future strength. To lose all of this was to stand naked before a harsh and unforgiving world. Some orphaned children were taken in by distant kin or generous neighbors, folded back into the fabric of clan life, but others found no such mercy. Without protectors, they became easy prey, sold into slavery, abandoned to beg, or left to wander as little more than shadows. Imagine a child watching the glow of the longhouse from the edge of the dark, knowing there is warmth within, food within, but no voice to speak for them, no hand to guide them inside. In the stories of the North, there are great warriors and fierce explorers, but rarely do we hear the voices of the forgotten children, the ones who bore the full weight of fate's cruelty. For the Vikings' clan was life from the first breath. To be orphaned was not only to lose parents, but to lose the very net that held the world together. And in that loss, childhood itself was stripped away, replaced with the lonely struggle to survive. Among the Vikings, exile was a fate worse than the sword. To be struck down in battle was an honorable end, one that might earn a man a place in Valhalla. But to be cast out by your own people, declared unwelcome at the hearth of your kin, was to be condemned to a living death. Exile was not given lightly. It might follow a killing that could not be avenged, a theft that shattered trust, or a betrayal so grave that forgiveness was impossible. When judgment was spoken at the thing, and the sentence was exile, it was as though a man's very name was torn from him. He was no longer part of the web of oaths and obligations that made up the clan. His kin were forbidden to aid him, forbidden to feed him, forbidden even to speak his name with pride. The punishment was as practical as it was spiritual. Alone, an exiled man had no safe roof over his head. No long house door opened to him. No field or fishing ground was his to claim. Every step beyond the settlement was a step into hunger and cold. And even if he sought company among strangers, they too would hesitate, for who would trust a man cast away by his own blood? Some exiles tried to wander far, hoping to find fortune in other lands, serving as mercenaries or traders under foreign kings. Others lingered in the forests and mountains, reduced to living like beasts, surviving on roots and game. Many did not last a single winter. To be exiled was not just to be banished from land, It was to be banished from belonging itself. It was a punishment that lingered with every lonely night, every empty stomach, every silence where once there had been laughter and song. For the Vikings, death was a door, exile was a void, and for those who suffered it, the world became an endless wilderness, with no hearth to return to, and no name to be remembered. Asterisk. In the Viking Age, there was a punishment more final than exile, more feared than death itself, to be declared an outlaw. This was not merely banishment. It was the stripping away of honor, the branding of a man as Ni Ingvar, a creature, without worth, a being less than human. When the thing passed such a sentence, the outlaw was cut off from every bond that made life possible. He had no kin to protect him, no rights under the law, no sanctuary in hall or field. To strike him down was no crime, to rob him was no theft. His very existence became a mark of shame. Hunted like an animal, the outlaw skulked in the forests, sleeping beneath roots and caves, surviving on whatever could be caught or stolen. He could trust no one, for anyone who aided him risked sharing his fate. Sometimes even his own kin turned pursuer, for the stain of dishonor spread like fire, threatening the whole family if they did not cast him off. The sagas tell of such men, wandering alone, haunted and desperate. Grettir, the strong, a hero to some, lived many years as an outlaw, but even his strength could not keep loneliness from gnawing at him. For strength of arm was nothing without fellowship, and courage meant little when no one stood to remember. Your deeds to be called un-Inger was more than social death, it was spiritual exile. A man so branded was denied a place in Valhalla. His name would not be sung, his memory would not be honored. He would be erased, body and soul, as though he had never walked among men. For the Vikings, to live without honor was worse than not living at all. And so, many outlaws met their end, not with swords in hand, but with despair in their hearts, fading into silence like shadows swallowed by the endless northern night. Asterisk. In the cold north, fire was life. The longhouse hearth was more than a place to cook food. It was the heart of the clan. Around its flames stories were told, bonds renewed, and the chill of the world outside was held at bay. To sit by the fire was to belong. To be fed from it was to be accepted. Hospitality was sacred among the Vikings. Travelers were offered food and a place to rest, for tomorrow they themselves might be wanderers in need, even enemies, if they crossed the threshold, and sat at the hearth, were owed protection until they departed. To share warmth was to affirm the bonds of humanity itself, but for the clanless, this door never opened. The outlaw who approached a longhouse was met not with bread and ale, but with suspicion and silence. A family might glimpse him through the smoke hole, hear his footsteps in the snow, and yet keep the door barred, for to give him aid was to risk dishonor. To let him sit by the hearth was to draw the scorn of neighbors, and perhaps worse, the sentence of outlawry themselves, and so he was left to the wind. The firelight that glowed so warmly for others was for him a reminder of exile. The laughter inside was a wound. He huddled in darkness, gnawed by hunger, the cold creeping deeper with each passing night. In the Viking mind, to be denied hospitality was not a small thing. It was a mark that one had fallen outside the very circle of human fellowship. To have no fire, no hearth, was to have no place in the world, and for the outcast. The long night stretched endlessly on, without warmth, without welcome, without hope. For the Vikings, the sea was both highway and battlefield. A vast expanse that carried them to fortune, to conquest, and to distant lands. But no man sailed it alone. A ship was not just a vessel of wood and iron, it was a family afloat. Each crewman had his place, each oar beat in rhythm with the others. Each shield hung side by side along the gunwales. To sail required trust. A helmsman could not steer without rowers to drive the ship forward. A lookout's cry meant nothing without warriors ready to act. The sea was unforgiving, storms rose without warning, waves broke like mountains, and a ship without a crew was little more than driftwood waiting to be claimed by the depths. For those with clan, the sea was alive with possibility. Brothers and cousins joined them on voyages, each man knowing the other's strengths, each bound by loyalty. Together they braved the storms, together they raised sails, together they returned home with spoils and tales that would echo in the longhouse for years to come. But for the clanless, the sea was a grave. No crew would take them aboard. Who would trust a man with no one to vouch for him, no honor to lose, no kin to avenge him if he betrayed his shipmates? And even if he found a place, it was often at the oar's end, nameless, voiceless, little more than muscle hired for a voyage. When danger came, such men were the first abandoned, the first left to drown. To set sail without kin was to sail into silence. No one sang for you, no one shouted encouragement at the oars, no one stood ready to pull you from the water if you fell. A lone Viking at sea was not a sailor, he was a ghost already drifting on the waves. In the sagas, the sea is freedom. But for the outcast, it was only emptiness. A vast reminder that without brothers beside you, even the strongest ship would carry you nowhere. The Vikings were not only raiders, they were traders. From the silver markets of the Abbasid Caliphate to the furs of the northern forests, their world was bound together by dangerous, winding routes across land and sea. But every merchant knew one truth: a man did not travel alone. Caravans moved together for safety. Ships sailed in fleets, and every trader carried with him not just goods, but the weight of his clan's reputation. A man's kin gave him credit, vouched for his honesty, and guaranteed that his debts would be honored. To cheat or rob such a man was to risk the wrath of an entire family, an entire hall of warriors who would not rest until vengeance was satisfied. But for the clanless, trade was perilous. No one stood behind their word. A promise made by an outcast was worth little, for who would enforce it? A bargain struck could be broken with impunity, and the cheated man had no kin to avenge him. Worse still, he himself was easy prey. Bandits, pirates, or rival merchants saw in him no threat of reprisal. To rob him was to court no feud, no blood price, no retribution, only silence. Even in the market squares, suspicion followed him. Without family ties, he was always the outsider. Always watched, always distrusted. Goods were sold to him at unfair prices, or not sold at all. And when he set out on the road, carrying what little he had managed to gather, each bend of the path might conceal those waiting to strip him of it. For the Vikings' wealth was measured not just in silver but in security, the knowledge that their clan's honor guarded every deal they made. For the outcast, there was no such shield. To walk the trading routes without protection was to walk a road where every man's hand might turn against you, and where the sound of footsteps behind you meant danger, not fellowship, in trade. As in battle, belonging was everything. Without it, a Viking was not a merchant but a mark, a man waiting to be taken. Asterisk. Marriage among the Vikings was never just a matter of love or attraction. It was alliance, contract, and bond. A union joined not only to people, but to families, to halls, to lineages. Through marriage, bloodlines intertwined, wealth was consolidated, and honor was renewed for another generation. For a man with a clan, marriage meant his kin could negotiate a bride price, secure alliances, and vouch for his worth. A father, uncles, or brothers would stand proudly to bless the union, knowing it strengthened their name. And when children were born, they were more than infants. They were the living proof that the family would endure, its memory carried forward in song and saga. But for the clanless, the path to marriage was barred. Who would offer a daughter to a man with no family to stand beside him, no bloodline to continue, no inheritance to pass on? To marry such a man was to marry into nothingness, to risk shame, poverty, and a future cut off from honor. Even if he were strong, even if he were skilled, his lack of kin made him a hollow choice. The sagas are filled with men who sought to leave a legacy, who longed for their names to be remembered through their sons and daughters. For the outcast, this dream withered. No bride meant no children. No children meant no one to keep his memory alive after death. His name would fade from the hearth stories. His line would vanish like footprints in snow, erased with the coming thaw. Among the Vikings, to live on in memory was as vital as life itself. To be forgotten was to die twice, once in the body and once in the soul. For the clanless, both deaths waited. With no bride, no legacy, he was doomed to be swallowed by silence, his bloodline ending where it began, as though he had never walked the earth at all. Asterisk. In the Viking world, the skalds were more than poets. They were the keepers of memory, the singers of honor, the chroniclers of glory. Kings sought their praise, warriors longed to hear their names woven into verse, and families treasured the songs that carried their ancestors' deeds across generations. A skald's tongue was sharper than any sword it could immortalize, or it could destroy. For men with clans, the songs were shields. To be sung of was to be remembered, to live on beyond death, to know that your name would be spoken long after your bones had crumbled to dust. To be celebrated by a skald was to have your honor bound into the very fabric of the community. But for the clanless, the skald's voice was a weapon turned against them. In verses whispered at feasts or shouted in the mead hall, they were mocked, belittled, their shame turned into entertainment for others. An outlaw's deeds, however small, might be exaggerated into ridicule, his name twisted into insult, his failures sung more loudly than his fleeting triumphs, and worse still was silence, for the skald could also erase. To be unmentioned, unsung, was to vanish from the living memory of the people. Without kin to beg for your name to be included in the sagas, the skald simply looked past you, composing verses for others, while your story withered unrecorded. For a Viking, death was not the end, but to be forgotten was the clanless man. Carried the heavy knowledge that no skald would raise his voice for him. No saga would preserve his name. No child would listen to tales of his bravery. He lived in a world where memory was immortality, yet he was doomed to disappear into nothingness. Mocked, if remembered at all. Thus the scorn of the skalds cut deeper than exile, deeper than hunger. It was the theft of eternity itself. In summer, the fjords glittered, the fields bore grain, and the sea teemed with fish. A man alone might scrape by, finding a meal here, a place to rest there. But when winter came to the north, the land itself turned against the solitary. The cold was no passing discomfort. It was an enemy, patient and relentless. The wind howled through the mountains, driving snow across the valleys, and the days shrank into a few pale hours of sun. Ice locked the rivers, storms sealed the sea, and the forests grew silent but for the creak of trees beneath the frost. In such a world, no man survived on his own. For those with a clan, winter was hardship, but it was hardship endured together. Families gathered around longhouse fires, sharing warmth, food, and stories. Granaries, stocked in the summer, provided bread, salted fish, and smoked meats were brought forth from the stores. When the wind battered the walls, men repaired them together. When sickness came, there were hands to tend the sick, prayers to lift the spirits, and brothers to dig the graves if the worst came to pass. But for the clanless, winter was a death sentence. No hall opened its doors to him, for hospitality was reserved for allies, kin, and those who could return the favor. He had no stores of food, no shared fire, no roof strong enough to withstand the storm. A lone man could hunt, yes, but the prey grew scarce, and the forests belonged to clans who defended their lands. Even should he kill a deer, he risked being hunted himself for trespassing. The sagas speak of frost giants, mythical beings of ice and storm, who threatened the gods themselves. But for the outcast, the frost giants were real enough. They were the cold winds that stripped his strength, the empty belly that gnawed at his insides, the long, silent nights where no friendly voice broke the darkness. To be clanless in summer was hardship. To be clanless in winter was despair. For when the snow closed in and the winds wailed over the fjords, the man without kin had only one companion, death, slow and certain, waiting just beyond the fire's last ember. A single man without a clan was weak, vulnerable, and easy prey. But sometimes, the outcast did not remain alone. In the forests, on the edges of settlements, along the forgotten stretches of road, those without kin found each other, and together they formed bands not of kinship, not of honor, but of necessity. These groups were fragile things, bound not by blood but by hunger. A man might join with another outlaw to hunt, to steal, or to raid, but there was little trust among them. Each one knew the others had been cast out for a reason, a crime, a dishonor, a betrayal. If they had betrayed their clans, why would they not betray each other? Yet survival sometimes forced uneasy fellowship. In the long winters, they huddled together for warmth. On lonely roads, they kept watch while others slept. Some became thieves, preying on merchant caravans. Others turned to mercenary work, offering their swords to whoever would pay, though without clan ties. Their loyalty was thin, and their reputations suspect. The sagas rarely glorify such men. Where clan warriors were remembered as heroes, these bands of the Forsaken were spoken of as shadows, dangerous, treacherous, and cursed. Still, in the cracks of society, they endured. A lone wolf could not bring down an elk, but a pack could. Even the dishonored knew that sometimes survival depended on finding others just as lost as themselves. But such alliances were always haunted by mistrust. Knives were kept close at night, eyes never fully closed in sleep. A stolen loaf of bread, an unshared kill, or a whispered insult could turn allies into enemies in an instant. For a band of outcasts was not a family, it was a gathering of men who had none. And so, even when the clanless sought strength in numbers, what they found was only a pale imitation of true fellowship. A band of the banished could keep a man alive for a time, but it could never give him belonging. The warmth of such brotherhood was always fleeting, always fragile, always one breath away from breaking apart. When a Viking fought beside his kin, he fought for more than victory. He fought for his family's honor, for the sagas that would carry his name, for the brothers at his side who would shield him in turn. But for the man without a clan, the only thing his sword could win him was silver. And even that came without glory. The clanless often turned to mercenary work, offering their strength to the highest bidder. Chieftains, jarls, or distant kings sometimes welcomed such men, for an extra blade could tip the balance in a skirmish. But these outcasts were never trusted. They were strangers, fighting not for loyalty or legacy, but for payment. A mercenary might march at dawn, shield in hand, shoulder to shoulder with men who cursed his name. He might charge into the fray, knowing no one would risk their life to guard his back. In the shield wall, honor was a bond. For the mercenary, it was a hollow word. He fought alone, even in the midst of 100 men. Some outcasts gained reputations for ruthlessness, becoming feared warriors for hire, their names whispered in dread rather than admiration. But fear is not the same as respect. A man might be hired for his skill with the axe, yet never welcomed to the feast after battle, never offered a seat near the fire, never invited to share in the laughter and songs that turned warriors into brothers. And when silver ran out, so did loyalty. Employers turned them away as quickly as they had taken them in, leaving the mercenary adrift once more. His only reward, a handful of coins, and the memory of blood spilled for men who would forget him by morning. The Vikings valued wealth, yes, but they valued honor far more. A hired sword gained the one and lost the other. And so the mercenary lived in a limbo, strong enough to fight, useful enough to hire, but never belonging, never remembered, never sung of in the halls of men. To live by the sword was dangerous. To live by the sword without kin was lonelier still. For a Viking without kin, home itself became hostile. Villages turned him away. Clans denied him entry, and the cold north offered no mercy. Some of the clanless turned their eyes outward across the sea, toward lands where no one knew their names, their crimes, or their dishonor. Foreign shores offered food, trade, and sometimes a place to vanish. The ports of England, the rivers of Francia, the bustling markets of the East. Here the clanless could slip into the crowd, their past washed away by distance. To the locals, a wandering Viking was just another stranger, another man with calloused hands and wary eyes. Yet living among foreigners was not the same as belonging. A man without kin in his homeland was doubly an outsider abroad. He had no claim to land, no voice in local councils, no family to tie him to the soil. He might work as a craftsman, or serve as a guard, or live as a drifter, moving from town to town. He could even marry into another people, though whispers of his foreignness never truly faded. Among the Norse, to be remembered in sagas was immortality. Among foreigners, the outcast became a shadow, his deeds spoken of in no hall, his name fading into the air. His children, if he had them, might never know the tales of their ancestors. His lineage severed by distance, as surely as by dishonor. Some thrived, carving new lives far from home. Others languished, never shaking the feeling that they were ghosts among the living, tolerated but never embraced. To live among foreigners was to escape hunger and the cold, yes, but it was also to surrender one's place in the great chain of kinship and memory that had defined the Viking world in the end. The foreign hearth might give warmth, but it gave no legacy. The outcast who vanished abroad traded one kind of exile for another, a quieter exile, but one no less final. Asterisk. Not all outcasts fled across the sea. Some vanished into the deep forests, the wild lands where no clan held sway. Among the trees and hidden valleys, they sought shelter from scorn, safety from the thing, and escape from the eyes of men. The forests of the north were vast and unforgiving. Wolves prowled the edges of the night, bears stirred in their dens, and spirits of the wild were whispered to linger in the shadows. For the clanless, these woods became both prison and refuge. They hunted deer and elk, trapped rabbits, and foraged for roots and berries. A solitary man could live this way for a time, though each winter pressed harder than the last. Without the stores of grain and salted meat that only a clan could provide, hunger always stalked at the door of the forest hut to the villagers. Stories of such men grew into legends, wild-eyed hermits, seen by travelers, dangerous outlaws, who struck from the shadows, or cursed souls who had forgotten the speech of men. Sometimes truth mingled with fear, for a man cut off from hearth and kin was no longer bound by law or honor. He lived as the animals did, by cunning, strength, and chance. But the woods also took their toll on the heart. Nights were long and silent, save for the wind sighing through the trees. Fires sputtered out quickly when there was no one to gather wood in turn. The silence pressed down, and the loneliness of the clanless was magnified by the vast emptiness around him. The Viking spirit was forged in community, in fellowship, in voices raised together in song and saga. Alone in the forest, the outcast found none of that. His life became a struggle of days, a survival measured in small victories, a fading echo of the world he had once known. To hide in the woods was to live, yes, but it was to live half a life, a shadowed existence cut off from all that gave life meaning. Asterisk. For a Viking with a clan, a raid was never just theft and bloodshed. It was a declaration of strength, of unity, of a people bound together beneath the same banner. Ships sailed with carved prows, proud as dragons, shields bright upon the rails, and songs rising in rhythm with the oars. Every strike upon foreign shores added to the honor of the clan, its tales woven into sagas that would be retold for generations. But for the clanless, a raid was something else entirely. A man without kin could not raise a ship on his own, nor summon men to row beside him. Instead, he might beg or bargain his way aboard another cruise vessel. Tolerated as an extra sword but never truly welcomed, He carried no banner, for no family claimed him. His shield bore no colors, no carved sigil, no proud mark of bloodline. He was a shadow among men, present in the fight but absent from the song. When plunder was divided, he took only what was given, a smaller share, a grudging peace, never the portion of one whose kin could demand fairness, if he fell in battle. No saga chant would name him, no kin would claim his body, and no mound would be raised in his honor. His death would be like his life, swallowed by silence. Worse still, many clans distrusted such men. To raid beside an outcast was to risk dishonor by association. A nameless stranger might flee at the first sign of danger, or betray his companions, for a larger share of silver. Without kin to hold him accountable, what bound him to loyalty? And yet, some of the clanless still clung to these nameless raids, for in the clash of steel and the roar of fire, they could forget for a moment their exile. For a heartbeat with axe in hand, an enemy before them, they felt alive, even if no banner ever flew above their heads. But once the raid was done and the ships turned homeward, the truth returned. They had fought in another man's glory, spilled blood for another clan's honor, and their own names sank back into the dark, unheard and unremembered. Asterisk. Trust was the invisible thread that bound Viking society together. Silver could change hands, oaths could be sworn, but behind it all lay the guarantee of kinship. A man was trusted not only because of his word, but because his family's honor stood behind it. To betray an oath was to stain the bloodline, and no clan could afford such shame. But the clanless had no such anchor. Without kin, his promises were empty. If he swore loyalty, who would punish him if he broke it? If he pledged honesty in trade, who would restore what he had stolen? If he raised his hand in oath before the thing, whose honor was at stake but his own, and who cared for a man's honor when it was already in tatters? Neighbors eyed him with suspicion. Traders offered him worse deals or none at all. Warriors on raids kept him at arm's length, fearing treachery in the heat of battle. Even when he acted in good faith, his very isolation condemned him. To the Vikings, distrust was not just paranoia, it was survival. And a man without kin could never be trusted, because there was no one else to answer for him. This curse of distrust poisoned every part of the outcast's life. If food went missing, suspicion fell on him. If a tool broke, whispers said his hand had weakened it. If a fight broke out, men assumed he had started it. The clanless man lived under a shadow that never lifted, guilty before judgment, condemned before trial. Over time, many of the clanless became what others already believed them to be. When every door was closed, deceit became a weapon. When no one trusted them, betrayal seemed easier than loyalty. Thus, distrust fed itself, turning suspicion into truth, and the outcast into the very thing people feared. To live without kin was to carry this curse always. Not hunger, not cold, not even the threat of death was heavier than this. To walk through the world and never be believed, never be trusted, never be more than a shadow in the eyes of others. Asterisk. For a man of the North, pride was as necessary as breath. To stand tall among kin, to work the land, to fight with courage, to share in the feast, these were the marks of life well lived. Yet for the clanless, such dignity withered quickly. With no family to hunt with, no rights to farmland, and no seat in the longhouse. Survival fell to the scraps left behind. Some turned to stealing. A sheep taken from a pasture under cover of night, bread snatched from an unwatched table, a purse of silver lifted when eyes were elsewhere. These thefts were not grand or glorious, they were desperate, petty, and dangerous. If caught, punishment was severe, for theft not only harmed the victim, but revealed the thief's lack of kin. A clansman's family could pay Wergold to make amends, but who would pay for an outcast? For him, the lash, the noose, or exile upon exile awaited. Others sank to begging. A pitiful sight in a society that prized strength and independence. The beggars stood at the edges of markets, or lingered by the road, hand outstretched, head lowered in shame. To give alms was rare, for why feed one who had no ties, no use, no worth to the community? Each crumb offered carried the weight of scorn, a reminder that mercy was not respect, and still others lived by hiding. A root cellar abandoned, a cave in the hillside, a lean-to in the trees, places where a man might curl against the cold and pray not to be found. To hide was to exist in silence, moving only at the edges of the day, careful not to draw notice, careful not to be driven away again. Stealing, begging, hiding, these became the rhythms of the clanless life. No feasts, no songs, no honor, only the gnawing hunger of the stomach and the deeper hunger of the soul, the yearning for a place to belong, and the bitter knowledge that it was forever denied. Among the Vikings, freedom was bound to honor, and honor was bound to kin. To be a free man meant to stand beneath the shield of one's family, to speak at the thing, to claim land, to fight, to feast, and to pass one's name to the next generation. Slavery. Thraldom was the very opposite of that existence, the lowest condition a soul could endure. For the clanless, the road to slavery was always near. Without kin to defend them, an outcast was easy prey. On the road between settlements, a man without a clan could be seized by raiders, bound in ropes, and sold like cattle in a distant market. No one would come demanding justice. No one would pay ransom. No one would even notice he was gone. Sometimes the trap was subtler. Debt could lead to enslavement, for a man with no family could not call on kin to repay what he owed. Hunger might drive him to serve in exchange for food and shelter, until service became bondage and bondage became ownership. Even his fellow countrymen could sell him, for what did it matter if a clanless man was lost to freedom? To the community, he was already halfway gone. For a Viking, the shame of slavery was doubled if it fell upon a man once free. A thrall born into bondage had never known another life, but an outcast sold into chains remembered what it meant to speak and act as his own master. That memory cut deeper than any lash. The clanless who became slaves vanished into the background of Viking life, rowing ships, tending herds, fetching water, grinding grain. Their names disappeared, their sagas unwritten. They were living tools, replaceable, forgettable. Thus, to be without kin was to walk always at the edge of a cliff. One misstep, one unlucky turn, and a man's freedom could be stripped away forever. The clanless did not only risk hunger, cold, or loneliness. They risked the final humiliation, to be owned. For the Vikings, life was never only about survival of the body, it was about survival of the soul. Every feast, every oath, every raid carried with it a spiritual weight. The gods of the north, Odin, Thor, Freya, and others watched over mortals, guiding their fates, rewarding honor, and punishing cowardice. But most of all, they looked upon people not as scattered individuals, but as branches on the tree of kinship. A man's soul was tied to his family line. His deeds were judged not only as his own, but as reflections of his clan's honor. If he died bravely, his kin would remember him, sing of him, and keep his spirit alive in saga and story. If he lived shamefully, the shame was borne by all his kin, a stain carried for generations. But what of the clanless without a family to preserve his name? His soul was adrift. No skald would carve his deeds into poetry. No children would whisper his name by the fire. No cairn would be raised over his resting place. To the Vikings, this was a kind of spiritual death. To vanish from memory was to vanish from existence itself. Even in the afterlife, the clanless were uncertain. Could a man without kin be called to Odin's hall, where warriors feasted together? Would Freya welcome him among her chosen? Or would he wander forever, nameless and homeless, like a ghost in the dark? The sagas hint at such souls, restless spirits, cursed not for cowardice, but for solitude. The gods rewarded those who upheld honor through kin and community. The clanless, by their very state, fell outside this order. They were seen as incomplete. Their souls weakened by the absence of the bonds that made a man whole. To live without kin was not only to be forsaken in life, it was to risk being forsaken in eternity. In the heart of Viking belief stood the promise of Valhalla, the great hall of Odin, where warriors slain in battle were welcomed by the Valkyries. There, amid endless feasts and contests of strength, the honored dead prepared for Ragnarok, the final battle. To die bravely, with kin and comrades at one's side, was to earn a place among the Einherjar, Odin's chosen. It was the highest destiny a Viking could hope for. But this destiny was not given freely. It required witnesses, comrades to see a man's bravery, skalds to sing of his deeds, family to remember his name. Honor was not only earned, it was proclaimed and preserved. For the clanless, this promise slipped like smoke through their fingers. Who would call on the Valkyries if no one stood beside them in battle? Who would carry their name to Odin's ears if no kin spoke of their courage? Even a brave death, if unseen, could be swallowed by silence. The sagas tell of great warriors, remembered for centuries, their names echoing in firelit halls long after their bones had turned to dust. Yet the clanless, even if they fought, even if they bled, were rarely sung of. Without a banner, without a clan, they faded into anonymity. In Viking thought, this was a second death. To be slain was the first, inevitable for all men. To be forgotten was the second, a death of the spirit, where even Odin's gaze might pass over a man as if he had never lived. Odin's chosen were lifted high, immortal in song and story. The clanless drifted into shadow, their courage unmarked, their souls unclaimed. For a people who believed that memory was life, this was the harshest fate of all. Not to be hated, nor feared, nor mourned, but to be utterly forgotten. Laid to rest, determined whether his soul found its path to the afterlife or lingered in darkness. Burial was both practical and sacred, a mound raised over the fallen, stones piled high, or a pyre blazing into the night sky. To be buried was to be remembered, honored, and guided into the realms beyond. But burial was not a solitary act. It required kin. A clan built the cairn. A clan placed the weapons and treasures beside the body. A clan spoke the final words, sealing the dead man's name into memory. Without kin, there was no one to perform these rites. A clanless Viking who died alone on the road, in the forest, at sea, might simply rot where he fell. His bones might be scattered by animals, his body left untended, his spirit untethered. This was more than dishonor. It was terror. The unburied dead, in Viking belief, risked becoming Draugr, restless spirits, trapped between worlds, denied peace. Without the protection of ritual, the soul could not pass cleanly into Valhalla, hell, or any other realm. Instead, it haunted the earth, wandering in bitterness. Forgotten by the living and abandoned by the gods. To a Viking, the mound was not only a marker of death, it was a safeguard of eternity. To be denied this was the most chilling fate imaginable. Thus, the clanless lived with a shadow always at their back, the knowledge that their deaths might go unnoticed, their bodies left bare to the elements, their spirits lost. In life they were outcasts, in death they risked becoming nothing at all. Among the Vikings, courage was prized, but reputation was everything. A man's worth lived in the eyes of others, in the strength of his kin, the loyalty of his comrades, and the words of the skalds who carried his deeds into memory. To lose honor was to lose life itself, for a dishonored man was no longer truly a man. This ultimate shame had a name. To be branded an Ingar was worse than exile, worse than defeat, even worse than death in battle. It meant one had broken faith with the values of the clan, perhaps through cowardice, treachery, or betrayal. Ingvar was stripped of belonging. He could not stand in the shield wall, could not take part in feasts, could not marry or make alliances. His very name was spat upon. Death was final, but it could be honorable. A man who fell in battle was remembered with pride, his saga sung for generations. But was a living curse. It followed a man wherever he went, like a brand, burned into his spirit. Even if he survived, even if he wandered far, the word clung to him. For the clanless, this danger was greater still. Without family to defend their reputation, without kin to swear oaths on their behalf, they were vulnerable to accusations of Once the word was spoken, there was little they could do to erase it. Their isolation made them easy targets for scorn. To live as a Uningrai was to live as less than human, outside the bonds of honor, outside the reach of community. In a world where a man's name was his legacy, was not just a stain. It was erasure. Death came for all men. But dishonor outlived the grave. And for the clanless, the threat of was a shadow that never lifted. To the Viking mind, courage was not measured only in battle, but in loyalty. A man proved his strength by standing firm with his kin, by holding his place in the shield wall, by sharing both hunger and feasting with his people. To abandon those bonds was to abandon manhood itself. Thus, the clanless were often judged not simply as unlucky, but as cowards. If a man had no family beside him, whispers followed. Did he betray them? Did he flee when they needed him? Was he too weak to hold their trust? To be without kin was to carry suspicion. To outsiders, the reason hardly mattered. Whether exile, orphanhood, or misfortune, the result was the same. A man without bonds looked like a man who had run from them, and in a culture where loyalty was sacred, flight was unforgivable. The clanless could protest, could swear they had been wronged, but their words held little weight. Oaths gained power only when sworn upon kin and gods together. With no family to vouch for them, their defense was hollow. Thus many outcasts were branded with the coward's stain. They were seen as men who could not be trusted in the shield wall, men who would slip away when the battle turned, men who abandoned firelight for the shadows. The bitter truth was that some of them did flee for survival, for desperation, for lack of another path. But others were cast into this judgment unfairly, trapped by the appearance of betrayal. In the sagas, bravery was eternal, but for the clanless, cowardice was the tale most often told. And once such a story clung to a man's name, it followed him longer than any shadow. In Viking society, kinship brought safety not only from hunger and swords, but also from suspicion. A man with a clan was accounted for. His deeds, his loyalties, his story were all woven into the larger fabric of his people. But the clanless, they belonged to no pattern. They lived at the edges, where trust frayed into fear. And fear has a way of becoming superstition. The outcast was often accused of carrying dark powers. Alone in the woods, surviving against odds, he became the figure of whispers. Perhaps he bargained with spirits. Perhaps he called on curses to strike his enemies. Perhaps he walked with the Jotun and trolls of the wild in a world where magic was real, where seeresses read the threads of fate, and runes carried hidden might. Such accusations carried weight. A clanless man might be avoided, shunned, not only for dishonor but for the belief that his very presence carried danger at times. This fear gave him a strange kind of power. People hesitated to cross an outcast if they thought he might curse their cattle, spoil their harvest, or call sickness into their homes. But it was a poisoned power, for it never turned into respect. It was fear without trust, suspicion without honor. The most tragic irony was that the outcast often lived no differently than any desperate survivor, gathering food, trading scraps, seeking shelter. Yet without kin to protect his reputation, every shadow seemed darker around him. Every gesture twisted into threat. To be clanless was bad enough. To be clanless and branded a sorcerer or cursed was to become less than human, a walking omen of ill fate. And in the long nights of the north, when the wind howled and the fire guttered low, few things stirred more fear than the thought of such a figure lurking just beyond the circle of light. Among the Vikings, swords and axes cut deep, but words could wound even more. No man proved this better than Egil Skallagrimson, warrior, wanderer, and skald whose verses could immortalize friends or doom enemies to shame. Egil's saga tells of a man larger than life, fierce in battle, sharp in wit, feared for his temper and his tongue alike. He praised those he admired in poems that secured their glory for generations. But to those he despised he gave a darker gift, verses laced with venom, curses carved into words that spread farther and lasted longer than steel ever could. For the clanless, Egil was a terror. Without kin to defend their honor, they were easy prey for ridicule, and ridicule from a skald could ruin a man completely. A warrior's deeds might fade, but the skald's voice carried across lands and generations. In one saga tale, Eagle composed verses words, meant to strip a man's honor, painting him as weak, cowardly, or cursed. He even carved such curses into wooden poles, raising them like monuments of scorn, calling down misfortune upon his foes. To be the target of such a curse was more than insult. It was a brand of infamy that could cling to a man for life. Imagine, then, the horror for a clanless man to be named in such a verse, with no family to shield him, no loyal kin to spread countersongs. His name was drowned beneath Eggle's mocking lines. The clanless already walked the world on thin ground. One curse from a skald like Egil could shatter the little dignity they still clung to in the Viking age. Swords broke bones, but poetry broke legacies. And for those with no clan, a poet's curse was the cruelest fate, the death of a name, the silencing of memory. If any story captures the terror of being cast beyond kin and law, it is the tale of Grettir the Strong. Grettir Asmundarson was no weakling, no coward. He was one of the most formidable warriors of Iceland, strong enough to wrestle trolls, bold enough to face ghosts in the dark. Yet for all his strength, he bore a restless temper, quick to quarrel, slow to yield. Misfortune followed him like a shadow, and so did bloodshed. When Grettir killed unlawfully, the sentence came down, outlawing, in Icelandic law. This was a living death. An outlaw could be killed by anyone, at any time, with no crime attached to the slayer. No man was bound to feed him, no hall obliged to offer shelter. To be outlawed was to be stripped of kinship, stripped of law, stripped of every protection that made life possible. Grettir fled to the wilderness. For nearly 20 years he lived on the margins, haunting the highlands, lurking in lonely farms, striking bargains with those desperate or foolish enough to aid him. His strength kept him alive, but strength alone could not give him what he had lost: belonging. The sagas tell of his bitter loneliness, his growing weariness, his slow descent into suspicion and despair. Even his victories over enemies, monsters, or the bitter cold rang hollow, for there was no clan to celebrate them, no kin to sing his name. In the end, Grettir met a lonely death, slain on a desolate isle after years of hardship. His saga does not end with triumph, but with silence, a cautionary tale of how even the mightiest Viking was nothing without kin and fellowship to the Norse mind. Grettir's fate was not heroic, it was tragic. For all his strength, he died as every outcast feared, hungry, hunted, and alone. The sagas are filled with mighty names, kings, jarls, warriors, poets. But for every name remembered, countless others faded into shadow. Among these half-remembered figures lingers the tale of Hildebrand, not a king, not a great skald, but a man who died with no kin to keep his memory. What little survives of Hildebrand comes in whispers, a restless spirit, seen wandering at the edge of farms, muttering in the wind, his eyes hollow with longing. Some say he was a warrior who lost his clan in a feud, others that he was outlawed for a crime too small to match his punishment. Whatever the truth, what mattered was this: he died without a burial mound, without kinsmen to carve runes or raise a stone. And so his soul was trapped. To the Norse, death was not simply an ending but a passage. The dead needed proper rites, fire or earth, prayers and songs to find their way to the halls of their ancestors. Without these, a soul might wander, restless and bitter, clinging to the world that had denied it peace. Hildebrand's ghost became such a warning. Farmers told of hearing him outside on storm nights, begging for warmth but never crossing the threshold. Children were hushed, with tales of his hollow form lurking beyond the firelight. His name, ironically, survived only because he became a story of fear, a spirit whose greatest crime was simply being forgotten. For the Vikings, this was the cruelest fate, to have no memory, no kin, no stone, no song, to become a ghost at the edge of the fire, forever reminding the living of what awaited those who lived and died clanless. Asterisk. Among all the sagas of Iceland, none carries heavier lessons about law, honor, and belonging than Unge's saga. At its heart are men who found themselves torn from their kin, outlawed, or forced into exile. The saga does not merely tell of blood, feuds, and fiery deaths. It reveals the crushing price of losing one's place within the web of kinship. In Ungeld's saga, the great assembly of law looms large. It was there that verdicts were pronounced, and there too that men could be stripped of honor and cast out as outlaws. To be named an outlaw was not simply a punishment but a social execution. From that moment, a man had no legal standing, no protection, no right to food or shelter. His name was a shadow, his future a hunt. The saga's tragedies show how disputes escalated, a feud sparked by insult, a quarrel answered with fire and steel. Yet the sharpest blade was always the verdict of exile. Warriors of great courage found themselves suddenly outside the circle of men, their fates sealed not by the edge of a sword, but by the absence of kin to defend them. Ungel himself is remembered for wisdom, not warfare. He warned of the dangers of vengeance and taught that law and kinship must bind men together, or else they would fall into ruin. His words proved true. When those in the saga ignored his counsel, blood flowed, homes burned, and men were cast out into the wilderness to die nameless. The saga teaches that a man without kin was already half dead. Even the strongest warrior could be brought low if the bonds of family, alliance, and law were cut away. Ungel's saga, then, is not just a story of feud and flame. It is a reminder that in the North, survival meant more than steel. It meant belonging. Asterisk. The Viking Age was not lawless chaos, as it is often imagined. Across Iceland and Norway, order was kept not by kings or armies, but by assemblies of free men. The thing here. Disputes were argued, verdicts pronounced, and honor weighed like gold on the scales. Yet the thing also dealt its harshest punishment. Outlawed was worse than exile. It was, in effect, the stripping away of one's humanity in the eyes of society. An outlaw became a man without kin, without protection, and without rights. He could be killed on sight, and no compensation was owed to his slayer. He could not inherit, could not speak at the thing, could not even accept hospitality at a fire. The records tell us of real men who suffered this fate. Some for grave crimes, murder, arson, theft. Others for quarrels that spiraled too far. In Iceland, where blood feuds could last generations, outlawry became a way to cut the knot of vengeance. Remove the man, and you remove the feud. One famous case was that of Skallagrimur Eskin, who fought bitterly with neighbors until the thing judged exile was the only solution. Another was the outlawing of Gunnar of Hl Arendi, the tragic hero of Ungel's saga, whose stubborn refusal to leave his home doomed him. History and legend blur here, but the verdict was real. Outlawry was not just a punishment, but a death sentence drawn out over years. The thing was, in many ways, the heartbeat of Norse law, but its harshest rulings remind us that law without kinship was unbearable. To walk away from the assembly branded an outlaw was to walk into a world of silence, hunger, and fear. In these true tales from the Thing, we see that Viking society had no prisons, no chains, no long sentences. Instead, it had something far more final. You belonged, or you were nothing. Asterisk. Not all stories of the clanless come from sagas and law codes. Some are written in the earth itself. Across Scandinavia and Iceland, archaeologists have uncovered graves that whisper of dishonor, exclusion, and lives lived outside the bonds of kin. Most Viking burials were rich in meaning. Warriors were laid to rest with their weapons, women with brooches and keys, farmers with tools and animals. The grave goods spoke of who they were, and of the kin who claimed them. A proper burial mound or shipgrave proclaimed honor to all who passed. But not all graves fit this pattern. Scattered through the archaeological record are anomalies, shallow pits where bodies lie face down, sometimes bound, with few or no goods. Some skeletons bear marks of execution, beheadings, broken spines, wounds not tended in life. Others show signs of careless disposal, as though the dead were buried quickly, without ceremony. These are often read as the burials of criminals, slaves, or outcasts. In certain sites, bodies lie outside the main burial ground, deliberately excluded from the community of the dead. To be denied the graveyard was to be denied belonging. Even in death, the message was clear. This person was not one of us. At places like Hofstafur in Iceland and settlements in Denmark, archaeologists have even found piles of bones, people stripped of the honor of an individual grave, tossed together like refuse. Whether these were slaves, dishonored men, or war captives, the result was the same: no kinship, no memory, no claim to dignity. For the Vikings, the afterlife was shaped not only by faith but by the living. To be given a proper burial was to be remembered. To be denied it was to be erased. The dishonored graves that dot the northern soil remind us that for the clanless, the curse did not end with death. Asterisk. To understand why being without a clan was so devastating, we must remember that Viking life was never lived alone. From the fjords of Norway to the windswept plains of Iceland, existence was built on collective bonds: family, farm, ship, and settlement. Survival in the north was a shared endeavor, not an individual one. On the farm, men and women worked side by side with kin. Fields had to be plowed, animals tended, and stores gathered before the long winter closed in. A single pair of hands could not hope to manage alone. Even small households were tied by webs of kinship to neighbors, allies, and in-laws. At sea, life was even more communal. A Viking ship was nothing without its crew, each man pulling his oar in rhythm with the next. To row alone was not simply exhausting, it was impossible. Navigation, lookout, steering, bailing, all required the hands and eyes of many. Feasting, storytelling, even worship of the gods was collective. A blot sacrifice was not performed by a lone man, but by a community gathered together, each participant strengthening the ritual. Law at the thing, too, depended on numbers. A man without kinsmen to stand beside him had no voice at all. In this world, to be alone was to be diminished. The Norse did not imagine the self as an isolated individual, but as a thread woven into a larger fabric. To be cut from that fabric, to live without kin, crew, or community, was not only to lose honor, but to lose the very structure of existence. Thus, isolation in the Viking world was not freedom, it was death in slow motion. In the Viking world, belonging was not only a matter of the heart or of honor, it was the backbone of the economy. To have kin was to have access to land, to wealth, to trade routes, to protection on journeys far beyond the fjords. To be clanless was to be cut off from these channels, like a ship adrift without a harbor. Land was rarely held by individuals alone. It was passed down through bloodlines, managed by families, and defended by kin. A man without family had no inheritance, no claim to fertile soil or grazing pastures. He could rent, perhaps, or squat on marginal land. But he could never plant roots in the same way as a man with ancestors behind him and descendants ahead. Wealth, too, was collective. A treasure hoard was not only silver, but a symbol of the clan's prestige. When wealth was divided, it flowed along bloodlines, cementing loyalty and obligation. An outcast had no share. Even if he earned silver by raiding or trading, it carried less weight without a kin group to back him, and no heirs to inherit it. Trade was perhaps the most dangerous endeavor of all. Long journeys across seas and forests required safe passage through foreign lands. Merchants traveled with kin or allies who guaranteed their safety. If disputes arose, compensation could be sought through family connections. A lone trader, however, was vulnerable to thieves, to betrayal, even to murder. Without kin, his goods could be seized, his death unavenged. The Norse economy, then, was never impersonal. It was an economy of belonging. Every coin, every cow, every acre tied to relationships of blood and oath. For the clanless, this meant that wealth slipped through their fingers. Even success could not root itself in the soil of kinship. 2. Live without a clan was to live outside the very system that gave meaning to labor and security to wealth. In Viking society, safety was never guaranteed by walls or weapons alone. It rested on the promise that if harm came to one person, their kin would rise to answer it. This was the logic of the blood feud, a system as feared as it was respected. If a man was killed, his family did not simply mourn. They demanded justice. Sometimes this meant vengeance in kind, blood for blood. Other times, it meant a wergild, a payment of silver set by law, balancing honor with compensation. Either way, it was the kin who pressed the claim, the kin who negotiated, and the kin who took revenge if no settlement could be reached. But what if there were no kin? A clanless man's death often went unavenged. There was no one to carry his name into the thing, no one to demand wergild, no one to sharpen the sword of vengeance. His killer might go unpunished, his body left to rot, his memory already fading, as if he had never lived. This was more than dangerous, it was terrifying. The knowledge that you could be struck down with no consequence, no reckoning, made a clanless life precarious at every turn. Even insults or thefts could be delivered, without fear of reprisal. Such a man lived in a world where the law barely touched him, and where others knew it. The Norse believed that honor was not only lived but defended. To have no one to defend your honor in life or in death was to stand naked in a brutal world. For the outcast, safety was an illusion, and vengeance, a dream that would never come. Asterisk. The verses of a skald was to live forever, your deeds echoing down the generations like the crash of waves on a fjord. To die unremembered was to vanish, your existence reduced to nothing more than bones in the earth. Outcasts, men without clans, suffered doubly. At times, they were depicted as fearsome wanderers, dangerous men on the edges of society, figures to be avoided. But more often, they simply disappeared from memory. The sagas tell of great chieftains, bold raiders, loyal brothers, and tragic heroes, but rarely of the clanless. When they appear, it is often briefly as villains or nameless foes cut down by those who mattered. Their stories were not sung because there was no family to sponsor the tale, no descendants to ensure the words lived on. This silence was a form of erasure. To the Norse, a man's worth was tied not only to his deeds, but to the people who carried those deeds into song and story. The clanless, even if they performed acts of courage or cunning, often left no narrative trace. Without kin, their lives were like shadows at the edge of the firelight, seen for a moment, then swallowed by the dark dot. Thus, the ultimate fate of many outcasts was not to be remembered as evil or even dishonorable, but simply to be forgotten. In a culture that prized fame as the path to immortality, this was perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. Asterisk. The Viking world was built upon togetherness. A longhouse was not just a shelter, but a hive of voices, laughter, quarrels, and shared work. Fires burned in the center of the hall, food was passed from hand to hand, and stories bound generations into a single living thread. To be part of this rhythm was to know one's place in the world. But the clanless man had no place. He might sit at a fire, but never at its heart. He might hear songs, but none sung of him. His meals, when he had them, were taken alone, without the comfort of voices filling the silence. In a culture where survival and identity alike depended on community, loneliness was not merely an emotion, it was a slow form of unmaking. Loneliness gnawed at the clanless in ways beyond hunger or cold. It stripped them of the daily affirmations that made a Viking feel human. The clasp of a brother's arm, the smile of kin across a hall, the reassurance that one's life was part of a larger story. Without these, the mind wandered into darker places. Some outcasts grew bitter, consumed by envy and rage at what they had lost. Others slipped into madness, muttering in the forests or talking to gods who no longer listened. The sagas whisper of men who became almost like ghosts in life, wandering the edges of fields or coastlines, feared less for their strength than for their emptiness. In a communal culture, to be left utterly alone was not simply to be miserable, it was to be stripped of identity itself. For the Vikings, whose very souls were woven into bonds of kinship, loneliness was as lethal as steel. Asterisk. Loneliness was deadly to the spirit, but for the clanless Viking, the body often broke long before the mind. Without the support of kin, every necessity of survival became a struggle, and the northern world was merciless. In the long winters, food was not merely scarce, it was rationed with care. Families stored their grain, dried fish, and salted meat to last the dark months. But the clanless had no storehouse, no rights to a family's hoard. Hunger stalked them relentlessly. Many starved quietly in the woods, their bodies discovered only when spring thaw melted the snow. Disease, too, struck harder at the isolated in the longhouse. The sick were tended by kin, given warmth and broth, perhaps even charms against ill fortune. Alone, a fever might be a death sentence, a festering wound, a slow ruin. No healer came for the man without ties. And then there was exposure. The Viking world was raw and harsh. Icy winds off the fjords, storms that battered coasts, nights where frost crept into the bones. Inside a hall, warmth from the fire and the press of bodies made survival possible. Outside, even with furs and courage, cold gnawed mercilessly. Many outcasts froze where they lay. Nameless cairns, built by strangers marking the spot. To live without a clan was to stand exposed at every turn to hunger, to sickness, to cold, to death. For those on the margins, the North was not the land of sagas and glory, but a silent predator, always waiting for the weak to stumble. Asterisk. To the Vikings, death was not the end. A warrior who fell with honor could live on in memory, in story, and if he was fortunate in Valhalla itself. Exile, by contrast, was a kind of living death, stripped of kin, stripped of honor, condemned to walk the earth as no one's son, no one's brother, no one's husband. For many, the choice was clear. Better to meet the sword, the axe, or the cold sea, than to face the long emptiness of life without belonging. The sagas tell of men who fought hopeless battles, refusing to flee though escape was possible. Some scholars believe this was not only about courage in the moment, but about the deeper terror of what awaited them if they lived dishonored and alone. A glorious fall meant song and story. Survival without kin meant silence and scorn. Exile left a man cut off from fire, from food, from fellowship. Death at least offered an end, and if faced bravely the chance of being remembered. Even criminals sometimes preferred execution to outlawry, knowing that to die before witnesses was to be marked as a man, while to vanish into the wilderness was to become nothing at all. Thus, in a culture where life was defined by bonds of loyalty and kinship, being clanless was worse than dying. To choose death before exile was not despair, it was the final act of belonging, a refusal to surrender one's place in the shared story of the people. Asterisk. The Viking world was not alone in seeing exile and clanlessness as worse than death. Across the globe, societies tied identity to community, and those stripped of belonging often faced lives of misery and scorn. In ancient Rome, exile was considered one of the gravest punishments for a citizen. To be driven from the city was to lose one's rights, property, and status. Though the Romans prided themselves on law, the exile became a shadow, surviving in foreign lands. His name whispered with pity or contempt. Like the Vikings, the Romans knew that being cut off from one's people meant the slow erosion of identity itself. In Japan, the samurai code of Bushido held honor above life. To be cast out, masterless, was to become a ronin, a figure both feared and despised. Some ronin found ways to live by the sword, selling their skills, but most lived in poverty, mistrusted and mocked. Their fate echoes that of the Viking. Outlaw, branded dangerous yet pitiable. A man unmoored from the very structure that gave him meaning. Even in medieval Europe, exile and outlawry left men vulnerable. To be declared wolf's head in England meant anyone could kill you without consequence. Much like the Viking on Inger, the community defined the man, and without it, he was less than human in the eyes of the law. These comparisons remind us that the Viking fear of clanlessness was not unique. Across time and continents, to be outcast was to be stripped of humanity, left alive yet erased. What made the Viking case especially severe, however, was how deeply every part of life law, survival, even the afterlife, was bound to the clan. In the Viking world, honor was as fragile as glass. It could take a lifetime to build, but only a single act of cowardice, betrayal, or insult could shatter it forever. Unlike wealth, which could be regained, or land, which could be fought over, honor, once lost, was rarely restored. A careless word at the thing, a botched duel, a refusal to answer a challenge, any of these could stain a man's name. The sagas are filled with tales where one rash decision led not only to disgrace but to exile. A warrior might falter in battle, and whispers would spread faster than the sword cut him. Soon allies withdrew, kin distanced themselves, and the man was left vulnerable to banishment. Sometimes the mistake was moral rather than martial. A broken oath, a betrayal of kin, an act seen as dishonorable. Such deeds carried a weight heavier than any crime of theft or murder. In the eyes of the community, they made a man unfit to share in feasts, battles, or even burial rites. What made this fragility so terrifying was its permanence. In a world without written law codes or appeals, reputation was all that mattered. One mistake could brand a man an Inger, stripping away not only his honor but his humanity. Thus, the Viking outcast was often not born of weakness, but of a single misstep. In a society that demanded perfection in loyalty, bravery, and duty, the smallest crack in the armor of honor could bring a life crashing down. Gold could be stolen, land could be seized, ships could sink. But a Viking's clantha network of kin allies and sworn brothers was the one possession that could not be easily stripped away. It was the truest safety net in a world ruled by cold seas, violent feuds, and harsh winters. A wealthy man without kin was like a fortress without walls. His riches made him a target, and with no family to avenge or defend him, he was doomed to lose them. By contrast, even the poorest farmer, if surrounded by loyal kin, could rely on shelter, vengeance, and respect. In times of famine, it was kinship that meant food on the table. In times of conflict, it was kin who raised the shield wall beside you. At the thing, it was family alliances that determined whose voice carried weight. And when death came, it was kin who raised the mound and carved the runes that ensured you would not be forgotten. To the Vikings, wealth was fleeting, but kinship endured. The clan was an unspoken contract, a promise of survival, vengeance, hospitality, and remembrance. To lack this was not merely to be poor, it was to stand naked against the world. This is why the clanless Viking was more vulnerable than the beggar, more cursed than the criminal. Without that safety net of kinship, he had no shield against hunger, enemies, or oblivion.
Though centuries separate us from the age of long ships and sagas, the fate of the clanless Viking still speaks to us. Their suffering reminds us that human beings are not made to stand alone. Survival, meaning, and even identity itself have always been woven from bonds with others. Today, Our clans may look different. Families, friendships, communities, even online networks. But the principle remains the same. Belonging grants protection, strength, and purpose. Isolation, on the other hand, carries its own quiet dangers. Loneliness has been called a modern epidemic, and while we may not starve when cut off from others, we wither in spirit all the same. The Vikings show us that belonging was once a matter of life and death, but it still shapes us now. Without trusted kin or companions, even the strongest feel weaker. With them, even the poorest stand taller. In remembering the fate of the clanless, we are reminded of a truth that echoes through the ages. Wealth fades, power slips away, but connection endures. To be seen, to be remembered, to be bound to others, that is the real shield against the storms of life. In the Viking Age, men feared many things: the storm that could sink a ship, the axe that could split a shield, the famine that could empty a hall. Yet beneath all these loomed a deeper terror, the thought of being cut off from kin. To be clanless was to live without shelter, without vengeance, without memory. It was to walk the earth as a shadow, present yet unanchored, unwanted by gods and men alike. Wealth could not save such a man. Strength could not redeem him. Even courage, in the absence of belonging, was meaningless. In a world where every feast, every battle, every story was shared, the clanless man was silenced. He had no voice at the thing, no shield in the wall, no place at the hearth. He had no one to raise his burial mound, no skull to weave his name into song. When he died, he vanished utterly, as though he had never lived. This, then, was the greatest tragedy in the Viking Age. Not death, for death could be noble. Not poverty, for poverty could be endured. But exile from the bonds of kinship. To be without a clan was to be denied the very essence of what it meant to be Viking, to belong. And so the sagas warn us, across the centuries, the man without kin is the most forsaken of all. Picture him now, the last lonely Viking. He sits by a dwindling fire, far from halls of laughter and the clamor of kin. The sea wind creeps through the cracks of his shelter, carrying with it the voices of a world that no longer claims him. Once, he may have marched in a shield wall, his arms steady beside his brothers. Once, he may have lifted a horn of mead in celebration. But now there are no brothers, no hall, only the crackle of embers, fading like his memory. He knows when morning comes, there will be no one to guard his back, no hand to steady his oar, no kinsman to carve his name in stone. His story will slip into silence, unremembered, like smoke vanishing into the night sky. And yet, in this final hour, there is a strange peace. The flames whisper softly, the stars keep their ancient watch, and the long cold of the north wraps him in its embrace. Close your eyes and imagine his last breath by that fire. A life without kin was the cruelest fate of all. And in remembering him tonight, perhaps we give him the one gift he was denied, that he is not entirely forgotten. And so the tale ends. The fire burns low, its glow soft against the long shadows of the north. The last lonely Viking fades into memory, his figure lost to time, his voice carried away on the wind. We leave him there, on that cold shore, not to dwell in sorrow, but to understand. His story reminds us of the cost of loneliness, the weight of exile, and the power of belonging. It whispers to us that even the fiercest warrior needs kin. Even the strongest heart needs home. Now, the sagas fall silent. The oars rest. The longship drifts into the dark waters of sleep. And you, too, may let go, carried on the tide of dreams. Rest well, for the lonely Viking has found his place at last. Not in the world of men, but here, in the quiet of your remembering. The saga is closed. The night is yours.